please raise the roof for the CEO at GitButler, the one and only Scott Chacon.
Thank you, sir. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. Wow, packed room. Look at this. It's fantastic to be here. So I want to talk a little bit about open source. Usually I talk about Git. Usually I talk about GitHub or GitButler or something. But there's a couple of things that have happened in the open source community. I feel like open source is one of those things like Git that people kind of assume has been around forever and isn't changing that much, but actually is, right? Like the community has changed, the world has changed, and I find some really interesting things in here that I want to kind of get you guys on board with. So I want to talk about open source. I want to start, however, with a quick story about Jam. So my co-founder and the COO of GitButler used to run this food group called Dillenero, and she packaged this thing called Himbeermarmelade. How many of you are German? Because I'm going to, OK, there's a lot of you. I'm going to butcher a couple of German words here. I really apologize for that, but it's important for the story. So she was selling this thing called Himbeermarmelade, which is raspberry jam. For those of you who speak German, might know that that's sort of the colloquial phrase that you would use for raspberry jam. And if you Google it, right, everything will come up with this, right? Himbeermarmelade, this is the way that you talk about it. You talk about jam, you say marmelade. Himbeermarmelade vom Oma, right? My grandmother's raspberry jam recipe. But the problem is that in Germany, legally, you can't sell something with a label that says marmelade on it if it's raspberry, right? How many of you know that? Does anybody know that? A couple of you know that. And the reason why is very German. There is a law, there's a German law called the Konfiturenverordnung, which is the raspberry jam regulation, or it's the jam regulation, right? So if you're not German and you didn't know if there would be a word in German for jam regulation, it turns out that there is. And then the jam regulation, it states very specifically what you can call different types of jam. And number 5 is marmelade, right? But most Germans will call like any jam marmelade. That's just sort of the Volksmund, right? That's the colloquial way of talking about it. And the reason why is because for every 1,000 grams, 200 grams of something has to be citrus fruit, right? That's the law. And so you can't sell Himbeermarmelade because Himbeeren doesn't have, it's not citrus fruit, right? Like that's not engaged in it. So she had to go through and relabel everything, right? Because colloquially, this is what it's known. But there was a small group of people who came up with a rule a long time ago that said it has to be this or else it can't be marmelade. And so I'm using this as a little bit of a story about how I feel like the open source initiative is essentially the Konfiturenverordnung for the open source world, right? They came up with a set of laws a long time ago, rules a long time ago, in a small group of a couple of people that said this is what open source is, and have said if you're not 20% citrus fruit, you can't be open source. And I ran into this the other day because as a co-founder of GitHub, watching GitHub grow up, right, watching GitHub get really big, I felt like the phrase for open source, what people think of when you say open source, is public on GitHub, right? That has kind of changed over a long period of time, but I feel like if something's public, if people are engaging in the community, then it is essentially, people would think of it as open source. What do you call something that's open source that's not under an OSI license? And so I ran into this, and I'll tell you a quick story about how not to open source something. So I have a company called GitButler where we're trying to build a new Git client, a new desktop app, a Git GUI, right? And so we've been working on this for a long time. This is what the client looks like. And we decided we're open source people. We rely on a lot of open source projects. We want to open source it. We want to be able to engage in the community. We want to be able to work in the open. We want to be able to have people look at the source code, learn from it, open PRs, research bugs, tell us what's wrong. We want to do everything that you do in an open source community, but we're also a VC-backed company, right? We took on some money. We're paying developers. We're spending all of our time and sweat and tears and blood and money in building this thing. And so we don't want it to be sort of taken away from us or taken from us and competed with, which happens sometimes. So what we did was we looked around And we looked for a license that wouldn't be an open source license. We were looking, do we do AGPL? Some people do this for sort of desktop apps if they don't want somebody to sort of compete with you on it. And we found this license from Sentry called the functional source license, which is brand new. It's sort of a business source license. So it converts to MIT after 2 years. It's essentially MIT, except it has a non-compete clause in it, which makes it non-OSI compliant. So we open sourced, I already did it. I already said the phrase I was not supposed to say, which is open source. We opened the source code. No, I can't say open. That's also verboten. We put the source code available on GitHub, and it's been great, right? We've been able to interact with the community. We've taken a lot of pull requests. We've worked it as though it's an open source project in the same way that you would do with an open source community. But we cannot say the phrase open source. And when we opened it up, when we made it public on GitHub, we said GitButler is now open source, thinking that in the Volksmund, really public on GitHub kind of meant open source. And I cannot tell you how much not to do this, right? If you put something public under a non-OSI license, do not use the phrase open source. So here's a couple of the tweets that came in from this. It's bullshit. You know, it's disingenuous. Don't use the term open source software. It's not actually open source. You know, consider something else. They're great, but it's not open source. You're a poser. I'm a co-founder of GitHub, right? Like, I'm an open source poser. It's fine. I'm a poser. And it's harmful and impractical, and so on and so on and so on. So this is the Konfitürenverordnung, right? Like, we didn't have 20% of citrus fruit in our open source, and so it's not open source. So don't do this, right? But the problem is, what do we call it? Because open source is not the logical negation of closed source. So if something's closed source, if something's proprietary, the difference, if you turn it public and engage in the community and do it in the open, it's not open source. So what do you call it, right? Do you call it source available? Do you call it community source? Do you call it functional source? I'll go into why we did this in a bit, but it's an interesting question. And I think it's an interesting need in the open source community in having source code available and working in an open source style, but being able to protect yourself as well. And we've seen a lot of examples of this. So I want to go into what is open source. For those of you who haven't been around for a long time, I'm very old. You may not be. I've been doing open source type work for a long time. What is open source? So I want to do a quick history of open source for those of you who have not been around that long. So in the 50s and 60s, right, source code was shipped with machines because it didn't make any sense to have machines without source code, but the source code was not valuable without the machine. So it's like an engine in your car, right? Like you wouldn't buy a car without an engine or switch out another engine or something. It's really integrated into what the value of the thing that you're buying is. And so source code was distributed openly with these machines, and people would look at it and fix it and send it back to the company, and then they would distribute the changes. And so it was a very sort of open source style thing, but you didn't really have to have licenses and things like that at that time because the source code was valueless without the machine. And then in the 80s, you started getting more, where the machines could run lots of different types of software, and so you started getting software companies, and software had value in itself. And so this is a picture. I tried to do a thing for Microsoft because Bill Gates did this open letter about stealing his software and distributing it on sort of freenet and things like that, and say this isn't fair. By the way, I knew that this picture of Bill Gates existed somewhere, and I tried to Google it, and I Googled sexy Bill Gates, and I have to tell you, please don't ever do that. There are a lot of results, and you don't want to see most of them. So, but in this, he says, hardware has to be paid for, but software is something to share, right? Like sort of tongue-in-cheek, and saying, implying that it's not, right? That you pay somebody, he paid somebody to work on this, he spent a lot of time on this, he didn't want to share it, but people are sharing it, so please don't do it. So what happened is that AT&T and IBM and these big sort of Unix distributors, they started closing down their source code and not distributing the source code anymore for this type of reason. And saying, we're just going to give you the executable binaries. You can't look at it anymore. You can't work on it anymore. And so guys like Richard Stallman came in and said, you know what? I run a university, I can't pay 100 grand for this Unix system so that my students can learn on this and I can learn on this and we can work on it and it's sort of this academic thing and be hobbyists about it or whatever. And so he came up with essentially, stick it to the man license, right? The GPL was really designed to say, we're going to write our own Unix. Screw you. If you want to use any of the code from that, you have to open source all of your stuff too. And so it had this sort of viral clause in it, right? And the real reason why was to say, you know what, if I can't use your stuff, you can't use my stuff, right? And it was really sort of fighting. And they built all of these tools, these GNU tools, and they didn't have a kernel. I don't know if anybody has ever actually tried to run herd. Actually, raise your hands if you've ever run herd on something. There's one guy, and he has a glorious beard that fits. I ran herd for a minute, but Linus came up with Linux, right, which was a kernel that was a Minix type thing and kind of filled in this gap, and so then we had GNU Linux. And GNU Linux in the early 90s was a toy, right? Like it really wasn't very valuable, but over the 90s, everybody said, okay, now there's something that's open and something that's free, and we can work on this and know it's not going to be taken away from us, and they built up this ecosystem. And so the question of why free software, right, this is called the free software movement, why free software, is it means for users that instead of these sort of corporate entities that say, I've built this thing, you can't have it unless you pay me a bunch of money, and even then, you can't really have a lot of it. They wanted to build a system that says, you know what, we just want to have it be kind of like it was before, right, where everybody has access to the source code, they have the freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change, improve the software, and they want to keep these freedoms. So open source happened because all of these cool open source projects started coming, or free software projects, I suppose, in the early 90s started coming up, and people started building really cool things with them. Things like Google, actually, right, came out of a lot of this free software stuff. The LAMP stack, right, MySQL, PHP, Perl, Apache, like all of these things started to be built, but it still wasn't coming from corporate entities, right, IBM and Microsoft, and like they weren't doing open source work at this time. And then this book was written. Has anybody read this book? Oh boy, not very many people. That's actually kind of surprising. This is a fantastic book. It's a very short read. ESR is an interesting character, but it's a great book, and it was written in the late 90s, and it was talking about, it essentially laid out how open source software as we know it today, of almost everything you do on GitHub, how it's done and why it's done, was laid out in this book and really inspired a lot of people to say, this is an interesting way of building software, as a bazaar, as a Linux-type thing with a lot of people, all bugs are shallow, right, lots of eyes, as opposed to a cathedral, a Unix that's built by AT&T and sort of thrown over the wall at you. And so about a year later, Netscape decided that they were getting killed by Microsoft with Internet Explorer, with Netscape, and they wanted to come up with an interesting way to sort of fight back. And so they open sourced. The open source didn't exist at the time, but they made their source code free. And this inspired the free software community to say, what can we do to encourage this, right? To help it so that companies can work on open source. And so a couple of people, ESR, and a couple of people from the Linux community came together in Palo Alto in the late 98, 97, and coined the term open source to sort of differentiate it from free software. Free software being this sort of politically focused, movement, right? And they said, we don't want it to be a politically focused movement. We want it to be a pragmatic business case to open source software that you had. And so Netscape open sourced it, and it was the first major company that open sourced something that was really, truly valuable. And they really differentiated it, right? So open source and free software are really the same thing. Like almost all software that's open source is also free software. Most of the licenses are compatible with each other. But it just had this mindset shift of, we'll let companies, we want companies to come into this, not just academics and not just hobbyists, but we want serious businesses to care about what we're doing here. That was 25 years ago, right? So this is when I graduated from high school. I was doing this sort of stuff. What has changed? How has open source changed in 25 years, right? I think most of us think of open source as kind of always existing. It really hasn't existed that long in the scope of things, but it has changed a lot. It's changed a lot in 25 years. It's not the same sort of free political sort of thing that it was in the beginning. It's changed really, really drastically. And I think, I'm coming from a place of incredible bias here, being a co-founder of GitHub, but I think one of the drivers of this change was Git and GitHub specifically, right? Because before GitHub, there were not a lot of companies that were involved in open source. You wouldn't go into a Facebook or a Microsoft or something and have, thousands of open source projects that you could find online. None of them really contributed to open source. It was very difficult to do. You would, there'd be a read-only CVS server, a Subversion server. You'd pull it down, you make some changes. You'd submit a patch file as an attachment to a ticket in Track or something crappy, right? Like, it was really, really difficult to do. And the big thing was that the workflow on working on open source software and working on proprietary software in your company were massively different, right? You'd have Perforce or something as your proprietary sort of source control system, and then maybe Subversion or CVS or something as open source stuff that had a public read-only view. But GitHub and Git, really Git specifically as a decentralized version control system, changed this. It made it so that you could have essentially one workflow for both of these things, right? As people started to use GitHub more and more for all of their proprietary work, right, for stuff inside their company, then the difference in the workflow and the difference between is this closed source or is this open source was a click of a button that said make this public, right, and throw a license on it. And so more of these permissive licenses were used more and more, MIT and Apache and things like this, where people were like, you know what, I don't care. I don't need to prove a point and have you use GPL and make sure if you use my stuff, then all of your stuff is open as well. I just want to put it out there and have a community around it and have people that care about the software that I'm building. And so that ushered in this era of corporate open source, where now, if you really think about it, almost all open source, like the vast majority of open source is now, it's not written by academics in universities and hobbyists in their garages the way that it was 30 years ago. It's written by companies. How many of you actually contribute to open source? There was a raise of hands, but I was behind the stage. Should be more of you, but okay, I'm not going to judge. I'm not here to judge. But most people that work in open source and most open source that you use is now patronized by large companies, right? If you think about Git, for example, as one example, it used to be sort of the side project of Linus, of the Linux kernel. Now, the maintainer is employed by Google, right? And most of the contributors are Microsoft and GitHub. It's a Microsoft and Google product now that almost all of the contributions come into. Most open source is contributed to and patronized by large companies, by corporations. And so it's really changed, right? As opposed to it used to be, let's stick it to the man. Now the man is writing open source. Like, everything that you're using is contributed to by the man. And so it's really changed what open source is, how open source is valuable, how open source is written. So if you think about Bill Gates at the time, right, saying, software shouldn't be sort of openly shared. Now Microsoft owns GitHub, right? Now Microsoft actually hosts almost all of the open source software in the world for free for everyone in this room. And that is a massive change in 30 years. So what I want to talk about is realizing that, right? Realizing that open source is largely a corporate thing at this point, that corporations depend on it, that most of our jobs depend on it, most of our companies depend on it, and it's written by us in companies, right, or companies themselves. And so what does this mean? What's next for open source? What doesn't work now, right? That you think about something that was written and thought about 30 years ago, how has it changed? How does it need to evolve? And so there's two big issues that I see in the open source community these days. One is developer sustainability, and the other is the problem of commercial open source. So I want to go into both of them. So some of you has anybody seen this comic before? This is an XKCD comic that I think is the best way of talking about the problem in developer sustainability today, right? And the easiest way to think about this is the recent XZ crisis, right? If you are an open source maintainer, and there are a handful of people here that maintain open source projects, if you maintain something that's really critical, your job is horribly thankless, probably, right? Like, people are mean to you, people want free shit all the time. Like, actually, having everybody on GitHub means that there's a lot of people that just want free stuff, that just want you to fix their problem for you, that think that they're owed this by you to make this thing better. And I think that that is something that's relatively new, right? It was that this hasn't been a thing until open source was very popular and very commercialized. But so much modern digital infrastructure really depends on some of these small libraries that nobody thinks about or even knows about, right? Like, how many people knew what XZ was before this was a problem that affected SSH, right? Like, this is a big problem. And essentially, the maintainer got bullied into being like, you're not paying enough attention to this, you're not good enough, I want more stuff, and was able to put in an exploit on purpose, right? Because there's just burnout. And so the question is, how do we get past this? How do we make it, if you wanted to be a professional open source maintainer that just did that well, how do you get paid for that, right? The only way today is to be patronized by some large company and to hope that they don't, change their priorities and shift you or fire you or something like that, which happens all the time, because it's very hard to focus on this. And so we need to come up with a way of having developer sustainability where you can maintain a critical open source project or a dozen of them and make a good living off of it from 1,000 companies rather than from one. I think that's incredibly important to figure out a way forward for that. There are some options for this, right? I think GitHub sponsors is a good one. That's one that funnels a lot of money from people that love open source projects or depend on open source projects into open source maintainers. But it's still difficult, right? It's still difficult to say, I have 1,000 sponsors and I can make a living off of this, or it's important. Like, what is the motivation for a company to actually contribute a couple of dollars or $1,000 or whatever, right? Like, what is the value that they get from that they can see in the marketplace? There are other ones as well. If your company wants to, and I highly encourage you to contribute to open source projects and maintainership, there's thanks.dev, there's LibrePay, there's Tidelift, there's a couple of these platforms where your company can say, you know what, I care about these projects, I want to make sure that they're maintained well, but it doesn't trickle down in the way that we really need it to for the open source sort of world to be maintained. There's a new one that the Sentry guys are starting called OSS Pledge, where you take $2,000 per developer that you have and make sure that you're giving it to open source projects that you depend on. And so GitButler is going to do this. This launches in October, but you can go to osspledge.com now. I would highly encourage you to think about trying to do this because it's incredibly important for our open source ecosystem to be maintained. So right now we're doing $6,000 a year to Tori because we rely heavily on the Tori framework. We want to try to figure out what other ones we can do, but it's very difficult. So this is something that we need to figure out. And then the second one is this new generation of commercial open source. So a lot of you will be aware of these commercial open source projects. These are companies where the founders sort of grew up in open source world. They want to do open source stuff. They want to have their projects be open source, but they're really afraid, like Hashicorp or Elasticsearch or Redis, of being jeffed, right? If Amazon comes in and takes your shit and hosts it and competes with you directly, what do you do, right? And so what most of them have done is relicense, and in a way that pisses off everyone in the open source community because it feels like a rug pull, when in fact they're just trying to figure out, how do I keep paying my developers to work on this thing that we've stewarded for a long time and have us be able to continue doing it, right? And it's really difficult. So you don't want Amazon to come in and drink your milkshake, and so what people try to do is switch to licenses that make it so that they can continue investing in the source code that they're sharing in a way that is sustainable. There are lots of solutions for this. You'll see a lot of companies do open core, so GitLab sort of has this open core model. There's a lot of dual licensing models, and now there's some business licenses, which are essentially open source licenses like the one that we're using, the FSL, that have a non-compete clause, right? So it's as close as you can get without exposing yourself to risk that you think is unreasonable. But what I find really interesting about it is that now the source code is out there. You can learn from it, you can borrow from it, you can contribute to it in a way that is very open source-like, but you don't necessarily have to be exposed to risk if you have investors or if you have employees that you need to protect, right? And so it answers the question. So we've had this question, actually. We've had this question with Sentry over the last 6 months of various actors in the space trying to be like, we want to have this be source available. We want to be engaging in our community in an open source-like way, but we want to protect ourselves as well because we're investing in it very, very heavily. And what almost everybody will do is just keep the source code closed And proprietary, that's the easy option. Everybody in this room probably works on closed source software for their companies. And I would implore you to think about, can you put this under a non-compete license and engage with the community and have it be open for people to learn and to contribute to in this sort of post-open source way. And so the question is, what do you call it? What Sentry came up with is something called fair source. This is launching next week or the week after, I think. We're trying to do this big push of saying, let's come up with a term that doesn't mean open source, that doesn't piss off, it's not sort of out of line with the Konfiturenverordnung sort of problem that the OSI has and doesn't make people get mad at you on Twitter. And so if you want to, what I'd really implore is to say, if you have a closed source in your organization and you want to engage in your community in an open source-like way, and nobody wants to sort of put themselves at risk, consider fair sourcing your code so that we can have more code, right? I think the next step, the future of open source, is to bring in things that aren't quite open source, but give us a lot of the benefits that we love about what the open source communities are. So I feel like this is what the future of public source code collaboration is, right? We need to make open source library maintenance sustainable somehow. I think we're still trying to figure out what that is exactly. OSS Pledge is an interesting way to go forward in that. And we need to start embracing, as a community, this accepted commercial source available licenses, right? So business licenses, fair source licenses, and start having a term for it that is understood by the community and say, this is not exactly open source, in the way that, for example, if you say open source, it's very interesting because is it GPL or is it MIT? Because that matters a lot. Lawyers care, your business cares, right? But in this way, I want to be able to say, hey, it's fair source, it's not quite open source, but you know what that means, and you know what you get from it, and you know what to expect. And so those are my asks. If you have a closed source software in your organization, make it fair source, right? Open it up. Put a license in that's non-compete. What do you have to lose, right? You can engage with the community in a way you couldn't before. You're not putting yourself at risk in the way that you would if you put it under an MIT license. But you can make more source code available. Like, what if everything on your computer, everything you were using, the source code was available somewhere? If you had a bug, you could go look at it, right? You could say, here's what the problem is. You could learn from how they built it. You could ask them very specific questions about why was it done this way. I think it would be a much more interesting world. And secondly, if you depend on open source software, which I guarantee you every single person in this room does, join us in the open source software pledge. Thank you very much.